Now we are, everyone connected. Professor Leonardo Ramos, Jorge Sanafria, Gladys Lecchini. Thanks for coming. Okay, everyone can listen. Yeah, is everyone listening?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Professor, can I start? Yeah, all right. Well, good afternoon and welcome, dear colleagues, professors, PhDs, and master students, and especially those who are interested in knowing more about the nature of this rich and diverse field of the international political economy, for short, IPE. Organized by the new master program in global and regional political economy in FLACSO, Ecuador, the purpose of these talks is to present and discuss central contributions from the field at the global, regional, and national level in several key issues of development and conflict with accent on South America from different perspectives. The space is, this academic space is not attached to any either orthodox, heterodox, comparative, or reflectivist, academic or professional orientation, as this space is defined by its plurality, mutual respect, and tolerance to different ideas and opinions. Today, it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, who is going to talk about what is the purpose of international political economy. As we know, a field of study without a unique and universal definition, neither in the world nor in Latin America, but marked today, as Professor Cohen defines, by dangerous mutual animus and unilateral disdain. A complex field where for some specialists, it is academic, strictly academic, emphasizing positivist or reflectivist explanations, while for others, its nature is the engagement and counseling, the production of policies and governance. Professor Benjamin Cohen is here today to talk about the state of the field, threats, challenges, and potential future orientations. Professor Benjamin Cohen is the distinguished Louis Lancaster Professor of International Political Economy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He was educated at the Columbia University, earning a PhD in economics in 1963. He has worked as a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and previously he taught at the Princeton University and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University. His research focuses on international monetary relations, US foreign economic policy, currency integration, sovereign debt, theories of economic imperialism, and the history of the discipline of international political economy. He's the author of 16 books, including most recently, Currency Statecraft, and particularly relevant today is for us his work on the history and development of the discipline, as Professor Cohen has been the originator of the concept of transatlantic divide in IPE, that is between the North American school and the British school. First, Professor Cohen is going to deliver his talk for around 50 minutes, 40, 50 minutes as he wishes, and then we will have a set of key questions prepared in advance by colleagues specialized in the field from different academic centers of the region. Finally, we will take questions from the public, and in all cases, I will moderate the time. Thanks, Professor, again, for such an honor, and please, you can start as you want.
Thank you very much, Ernesto. And thank you, everyone who has taken the time to join this session today. I know that choices have to be made in busy lives, and I appreciate the fact that you've taken some time to join this discussion today. My subject is summarized in the title: what is the purpose of international political economy? Now, I'm going to try, if I can manage it, to pull up a set of slides that will go with my talk. There it is. Can everybody see that?
Perfect, Jerry.
Yep. Okay, fine. Let's see if I can just. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So, a little background. As you know, I wrote a book over a decade ago called International Political Economy and Intellectual History, in which I suggested that there are two major schools in international political economy. Turned out that I was wrong, that there are many more than just two schools. And so I followed with another book called I've forgotten already what the title was. Advanced Introduction to International Political Economy, in which I talked about the development of the field literally around the globe, including Latin America, China, and elsewhere. That book led me in turn to think about some of the problems that I see in the way the field has developed over the last half century or so. And so I am currently in the process of writing yet another book, which is going to be called Rethinking International Political Economy. And the subject today, the purpose of IPE, is drawn from one of the chapters in that book manuscript, which is still developing. I suspect that as a result of our discussion today, I will go back and make a few adjustments in that chapter, but we'll see. My purpose with this book is to think about what I think of as certain pathologies in the way that the field of international political economy has developed. Pathologies which threaten the health of the field. And I hope I can make the case for rethinking a good deal about the field, but we'll see. I will look forward to questions that you will have and to a lively discussion. Now, I start with the basic question. Why do we study this subject? It's possible, of course, that we study this subject because we see it as an opportunity for a career. But I'm trying to think more in terms of what is the collective reason for studying IPE? Why do we as a group, we scholars of international political economy, the hundreds of us around the world who think about this, why do we study this? In thinking about this, it occurred to me that there are basically three broad possible purposes that the field might seek to serve. And I like alliteration, so I started with comprehension, critique, and counsel. Comprehension refers to a field of study that searches for a better understanding of how the world works. Much of what we do in the academic world is detailed empirical analysis of cause and effect relationships. The emphasis is on observation, accurate empirical observation, and interpretation. Much of the work that is done by scholars around the world takes the broader setting for granted, the broader global system, and studies at the micro or mid-level of theory. Much of this work studies cause and effect relationships. How do we explain variance of behavior in some area? How do we explain reactions to certain problems and so on. That's what I call comprehension. Critique is quite different. Critique involves work that challenges the status quo, and in particular, challenges the basic assumption of comprehension of a given system. The emphasis is on the prevailing social order. In particular, the emphasis is on revealing deep defects. And the idea is to promote radical structural change. The work that I have in mind is work that is more critical in nature. Systemic level theories like world systems theory, or the work of Bob Cox, Marxism, of course, the critical theories of all kinds, including versions of IPE that incorporate history, or incorporate feminism, or incorporate culture, or incorporate colonialism, for that matter, the notion of coloniality. That's a second possible purpose for the field. And the third is to offer practical advice to policymakers, to be directly useful in the policy process. The council emphasizes developing effective policy strategies for problems out there in the world. That's my starting point, that there are these three broad possibilities. I then looked at the field today, and I did that in a number of ways, which I'll get to in a few minutes. I do have to emphasize that purpose for the field is rarely articulated. It's a question more of unspoken assumptions, and so it has to be judged by observation. It's hard to find. It really is hard to find outside of basic textbooks. It's very hard to find statements that say the purpose of IPE is. Now, if we look at the work across the more advanced economies, that is to say North America and Western Europe, plus Australia and New Zealand, what we find is that generally only two of the three possibilities are much in evidence. We see a lot of work that emphasizes comprehension. This is the favorite of the mainstream orthodoxy, what I called in my intellectual history book, what I called the American school. The American school is characterized by an emphasis on positivism and empiricism. That is to say, positivism meaning objective analysis that's passion-free, that's not biased, at least not, it tries to avoid bias. And empiricism means scientific method of one kind or another, quantitative or qualitative. The orthodoxy favors analysis of relationships within a given system, what sometimes is referred to as normal science. Critique is the favorite more of more heterodox or radical approaches, as I just was suggesting. Both can be categorized as academic in the sense that they emphasize the purity of theory and research. They emphasize the academic nature of the work. Counsel is most conspicuous by its relative absence. There are, of course, scholars who do become very much involved in the policy process. But in the advanced economies, they are the exception, not the rule. In general, what we find is that in more advanced economies, scholars have a preference for the ivory tower rather than the public arena. That is to say, they have a preference for academic research that emphasizes analysis, emphasizes empirical analysis, emphasizes theorizing rather than policy application. Now, there are exceptions, of course, once we move away from the advanced economies. Latin America is certainly an exception. The tradition of IPE in Latin America has frequently emphasized offering advice to the state. That was true in the early period of structuralism and dependency theory, and it seems to be true today as well. That IPE specialists in Latin America are very much concerned with the policy process. And that's even more true in China, where there is a growing community of scholars working in the field of international political economy. But the work there is very much state-centric, which means really Sino-centric. That is to say, centers on China, on problems that are faced by the Chinese government. There's an expression to describe the style of work in China, which is problem response, problem/response, which is you read article after article, and the first half of the article describes a problem, and the second half of the article describes what would be a good policy response to that problem. It's not informed by theory. It's not an attempt to build theory. It's very much concerned with making a contribution to public policy. So in China and in Latin America, we have notable exceptions, but in the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream of IPE in North America and in Europe, where in terms of numbers, the largest number of IPE scholars are located, the emphasis is on comprehension or critique rather than on counsel. There's this skew, as I described it, in favor of the more academic pursuits, but at the same time with deep divide between them. I have on the slide here, it says evidence private surveys. In preparing the book that I'm working on now, Rethinking IPE, I've hired several students to do some work for me, surveying wide bodies of literature. Two in the English language, one body of literature more of the conventional American school, the other body of literature, what sometimes has been referred to as the left out, more critical theorists in the English language. And then a third was focused on work in Latin America. I had a Latin American student from Guatemala who translated a lot of work for me. And the fourth was China, because I have several Chinese students who could do translations for me as well. It was very clear that while Latin America and China do have an emphasis on policy analysis, in the so-called mainstream schools of the Atlantic area, of the Anglosphere plus continental Europe, in those areas, there clearly is a bias toward either comprehension or critique rather than counsel. Now, in my argument is that this implies that we are faced with two pathologies. A pathology in medical terms is something that threatens your health. A cancer is a pathology. A flu is a pathology. A coronavirus is a pathology. I see two pathologies here. One that I call mutual animus. Ernesto mentioned these in his introduction. The other I call unilateral disdain. Mutual animus refers to the interaction between orthodox work which emphasizes more comprehension, and heterodox work, otherwise known as radical or critical, which emphasizes critique. And I see this as a dialogue of the deaf that is a threat to the health of the system, of the field. And then there's unilateral disdain, the disinterest in applied policy analysis in the more advanced economies, lack of systematic public engagement. I want to talk about each of those a bit in turn. Mutual animus. The problem I see here, the more I read in the literature of IPE, outside of the literature that is studied in the United States, the more I find that there's time wasted on confrontation, on outright confrontation and hostile observations between orthodoxy, the mainstream work that might be called the American school or the American style, and heterodoxy, the more critical or radical type of work. Orthodoxy emphasizes normal science. Heterodoxy emphasizes normative judgments. Each side judges the other in terms of its own preferences, rather than by the norms of the counterpart. There's only one true faith. And other faiths, other creeds, other views are dismissed as nonconformist, in effect. You can put it in religious terms. Remember that every piece of work that's informed by theory starts with a paradigm of some kind, a set of assumptions about how the world works, a set of assumptions that says that the main relationships, the main actors, and the main relationships that we're interested in over here, the rest we can put into a basket that we simply assume we don't have to worry about. That's the notion of a paradigm. Synonyms for paradigms are models or theories, and they share with religious beliefs an essential element of faith, that this is the way the world works. Paradigms are normal in the social sciences. This is not a criticism of the use of paradigms, because the only alternative to using a paradigm which assumes certain things is to try to analyze everything simultaneously, which is beyond our capacity. The advantage of a paradigm is to make analysis manageable, tractable. And there's nothing wrong with that. Where one can be criticized, where error might occur, is in what assumptions are made. Now, I came out of economics, as Ernesto said, my degree was in economics. And of course, in economics, economists are the subject of much humor, because so much of economics starts with saying, assume such and such. You know, the old joke about people on a ship that's shipwrecked, and they're on a desert island and they're starving to death, and a case of canned food floats up on the beach, and they're trying to figure out how to open the cans. And the economist says it's no problem at all. Assume a can opener. That's a very old joke, and you probably are all familiar with it. But I've always felt that it was a good example of the way that the economists articulate their assumptions in order to make analysis tractable. That's a paradigm, and there's nothing wrong with making assumptions of that kind. But the problem is that in our field of international political economy, anyone who does not share my paradigm is going to be an object of abuse. I have two examples here. The first example was from an exchange of emails that I had with a very senior colleague at a major university, a leading university in the United States, where I was pleading with him to be more tolerant of work that is not in the traditional orthodox, conventional American style. And this is what he wrote to me. There's really not much room for discussion. There's simply not enough common language or enough common understanding. Conversations across this barrier are essentially fruitless. That's throwing up his hands and simply saying there's no point to even considering that there might be any value in work of a different style. And then there's this quotation from the Palgrave Handbook of Critical IPE that said, from a normative standpoint, mainstream approaches can be considered to be not emancipatory because they take basic socioeconomic and political structures as neutral categories. One of the, as you all well know, one of the fundamental characteristics of more heterodox work that is in the tradition of critical theory or world systems analysis or Marxism or any number of schools of thought, is it intends to be emancipatory. It intends to find deep defects from which we can be emancipated. And any analysis that fails to do that is simply considered unacceptable. Why do I, excuse me, why do I emphasize this issue of mutual animus? It's because it seems to me that if uncontrolled, if left uncontrolled, it is uncontrolled now, but if it is left uncontrolled, it can lead to irreversible fragmentation and rupture. The field can disintegrate. This is common enough in the social sciences that we shouldn't ignore the possibility. You know, a little history of the political economy is useful. In the 18th century, in the period of the Enlightenment in Europe, a field of study developed that came to be called political economy. And no one questioned that economics and politics were all mixed up together. But in the last few decades of the 19th century, those two disciplines split apart. The field disintegrated, it fragmented, it ruptured. And we, on the one hand, we had some people who went one way and said, we're going to do something that we call economics, not political economy, but economics. And the different group that said, we'll do something called political science. And those two traditions, those two disciplines, split so far apart that by the time I was a graduate student back in the 1950s, indeed, it wasn't the 1950s, I graduated, I'm an old man. They didn't talk to each other. They never even had a word for each other. As a major in economics, I never heard anything about politics. I never heard anything about institutions and interests and governance issues and so on. And in the political science courses that I took, I never heard anything about economics. I never heard anything about markets or things of that kind. It was only in Latin America, the remarriage, if you will, of economics and political science was already starting in the 1950s with structuralism, with dependency theory. But in the Atlantic area, that didn't start until the end of the 1960s with the work of people that like those that I celebrated in my book, my intellectual history book, the people I called the Magnificent Seven. We have to be aware of the risk that the more and more mutual animus there is between more orthodox style and more heterodox style, the more danger there is of the field breaking apart. Then there's unilateral disdain. As I think about it, there seem to be two problems here. One is a reluctance to engage directly in applied policy analysis. Most work is directed to to more academic discussion, not to applied policy analysis. But even when specialists in IPE choose to try to engage in policy discussion, there's also a problem that so often there is a failure to communicate effectively. I don't think I have to say much to persuade you. All you have to do is pick up any of the economic journals, the IPE journals, imagine you're a policymaker faced with a problem, and somebody says, well, there was this piece in the Review of International Political Economy, you might take a look at. So the policymaker picks up the issue of the Review of International Political Economy and finds the article and finds that first few pages are literature review, and then the next few pages are setting up a puzzle, and then the next few pages are outlining a research design and data sources, and then the next few pages are a representation of the major empirical results and so on, by which time the policymaker has put the journal down and will never look at it again. That's the big danger. If one is going to engage in policy work, engage in the public domain, one has to be able to communicate effectively. When I finished my PhD in economics, my first 2 years before I started my academic career, my first 2 years I was hired as a research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the biggest of the 12 district banks of the Federal Reserve System. And I went to work in the research department, and my division chief was a very lovely woman. Yes, woman. Very unusual in those days. But one of the first things she said to me was, any assignment that she would give me, any assignment that I would have, I could not write more than 9 pages. She said, absolutely no more than 9 pages. Naively, I asked why. She said, because your work will go up to the officers of the bank, or possibly down to Washington. And what do policymakers do? They're busy. They've got busy schedules. They're working hard. Lots of balls in the air and so on. So the first thing they do is they look at the last page to see what the page number is. If it's a double digit, she said, 10 or more, they put it aside and never get to it. So I learned the value of being precise, of being concise in my writing, because otherwise they weren't going to read it. Now, what's the danger here? The danger is that if there isn't any willingness to participate in the public domain, to offer commentary on policy issues, to offer suggestions on policy process, without that, the question will be raised: what's the point of the field? Why does the field exist at all? Who cares? It could come to be dismissed simply as irrelevant, an ivory tower sideshow. I did a little survey involving some journals, just to provide evidence for the extent of unilateral disdain in the mainstream journals. I took the 2 most highly rated IPE journals today, International Organization and Right, the Review of International Political Economy, for this 5-year period, 2014 to 2019. And I identified all the articles in those two journals that could be said to have IPE content. There were 38 in International Organization, and there were 198 in the Review of International Political Economy. And then I categorized each of them, I coded them in terms of their principal emphasis: comprehension, critique, or counsel. And you see the numbers there. It's quite striking. Comprehension overwhelmingly in both journals. Counsel less than 10% in either of them. Clearly, the bias there is much more toward academic style work rather than toward public policy analysis. Now, you could say, but the fact is that these are academic journals. These are not meant to be journals for policy analysis. They're not meant to be journals to be read by policymakers. They're part of the academic activity of the field. So I then looked at two very highly rated journals that are in fact concerned with policy, are in fact concerned with making contributions to public debate on policy issues. And I coded the proportion of the articles that had IPE content. And what I found, as you can see, is that a very low percentage, 15% in foreign affairs and 14.4% in international affairs, a very low percentage were IPE articles, which suggests that there just isn't much IPE policy work being done, at least not in the advanced economies. Foreign Affairs is the House Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. It represents a major American publication. International Affairs is the House Journal of Chatham House in London. And in the English language in these areas, it's clear that there just isn't much work that's focused, much IPE work that's focused on policy applications, if such a small percentage of what's published in these two leading policy journals is any indication. Now, you may or may not agree with me that these are pathologies: mutual animus and unilateral disdain. Excuse me. You may not agree with me. I am quite prepared to be told that I don't know what I'm talking about. But on the assumption that I might actually have put my finger on something, I want to conclude by considering briefly what might be done about these two pathologies. When it comes to mutual animus, excuse me, I seem to have developed a tickle in my throat. In addressing the issue of mutual animus, is to replace that with mutual understanding. In the chapter that I've drafted on this, I reproduce an old Talmudic story. For those of you who are not familiar with the Jewish Talmud, I'm Jewish, of course, and the Talmud is the record of 400 years of debate that started before the birth of Jesus and lasted afterwards. 400 years of debate of Jewish rabbis in Jerusalem and in Baghdad. They are the heart and soul of the Jewish religion. Very often in the Talmud, a rabbi tells a story and then they spend the next 40 pages dissecting the story and trying to find a meaning to it. And a story that comes to mind in this context is of a rabbi in a small village somewhere in Eastern Europe back in the old days, who was asked to resolve a dispute between two of his fellow residents of the village. So he listens to the first of the two people, and he says, "You're right." And there are protests. Wait, you haven't heard the other side. Let the other man say something. So he hears the other side, and he says, "You're right." And again, there's an uproar. How can they both be right? They can't be both. They can't both be right, can they? And the rabbi says, "You're right." Now that's the story, and that's very typical Talmudic stories, because it can be understood in many different ways. My preference is to think about it this way. Now, what the Rebbe was trying to say is that each of them had to learn that the other guy also had some right on his side. Each of them had to, as a starting point, not just dismiss the other, but rather to say, well, the other he may have some point there. That's the idea that I would like to see promoted in the IPE field, to get past this idea, this tendency toward mutual animus. In teaching, for example, it seems to me that it would be really beneficial if each of us in our course syllabi, our reading list, if we would include additional material from outside our own comfort zone. I've seen enough syllabi in the United States to know that it doesn't work that way in practice. What we have is a tendency for people to put material on the reading list, which is strictly from their own style of IPE. In the United States, critical theorists rarely make it into the syllabi of mainstream universities. And even on the other side of the Atlantic, say at Warwick, where it was German who studied in Warwick, I believe. There may be a few American authors represented, but for the most part, there's exclusion as well. It seems to me that there ought to be more incentive to include material that challenges rather than simply replicates a style that the instructor is familiar with. In scholarship, there ought to, again, be incentives to encourage people to take account of perspectives other than their own in their writing, to think about what other perspectives might have to say on the subject, rather than just to stick to the one analytical approach, the one paradigm, the one perspective. Faculty appointments. We know that universities tend to replicate certain preferences when hiring. And as a result, departments develop certain personalities. Some are known for their liberalism, others for their realism, others for the constructivism, and so on. It seems to me that more could be done to expose students and others in the field to a mixture of views by approaches, by reforms of this kind. Likewise, unilateral disdain, it seems to me that there are possibilities that could be pursued. In scholarship, a greater emphasis on effective communication. Scholars really don't write very clearly. I think that in some cases, the style of writing in the academic world is deliberately intended to be obscure on the grounds that the more difficult it is to read, the more profound it must be in nature. The fact is that we can't expect policymakers to pay attention, given the style of writing that tends to dominate. An alternative approach would be to do what some scholars do in the United States, possibly in Latin America. I'd be interested to know. Of developing a serious academic theory-driven piece, and then from that, develop a second piece that would summarize in much more accessible terms the same line of argument, to be published in a more policy-oriented publication. Faculty standards. University of California, we have regular merit reviews. Other university systems do as well. But as so often is the case, the emphasis is on publications, particularly publications in straight academic research journals, and little emphasis on public engagement. I have a former student who's now a senior faculty member at the London School of Economics, and when we corresponded on this subject, he said that in the system that they have in Britain, it always comes down to three things: publications, publications, publications. That is something that could be reformed. In journals, I wrote a piece more than a decade ago called "Are IPE Journals Becoming Boring?" And I suggested that a few pieces of policy-oriented research could be sacrificed in order to make more room for policy discussion. I actually was a member for many years of the board of editors of International Organization. I kept arguing for this point of view, and I kept being slapped down that no, we are a research journal and we only emphasize research. But the result is that for those in the field who really would like to be more policy relevant, who would like to emphasize more counsel rather than comprehension or critique, they would benefit from an opportunity to offer more commentary on policy. I've been the beneficiary of a more flexible policy review of international political economy. A couple of my pieces were published that were under the heading commentary. I think that there should be a lot more of that. Agenda setting. There are obvious power centers that control much of what gets accepted, say for it. Program chairs who control what will get accepted to appear on a program of a conference. Funding sources that determine who will get money to support their research and so on. And then finally, awards. The International Studies Association has an award, has several awards: a Distinguished Scholar Award, a Mentor Award, and then it has an award for scholars who are publicly active. I've forgotten the exact title of it, but it's an award for outstanding public service. Effectively, an award for scholars who choose counsel over comprehension or critique. But that's about the only award that I'm aware of that does that. If we had more of those, it might create some incentive for more such work. My conclusion. I think it's relatively easy to see what the problems are, to see that there is a tendency toward both mutual animus and I use the term mutual animus and unilateral disdain. It's easy to see what the problems are. It's also easy to see what could be done to cope with the problems. The challenge is implementation. It's a collective action problem. There's a common interest, I would argue. There is a common interest in doing more to, along the lines I outline here. There's an argument can clearly be made that more of that is needed. But do we have a privileged group? Do we have a group, in terms that Mansur Olson put it in his original treatise on the logic of collective action? Do we have a privileged group, a group that will benefit so much from undertaking collective action that it will be worth it to them to bear the cost? Translated into more accessible language, who's going to be the first mover? There has to be leadership of some kind. These are the gatekeepers, the people who determine what gets published, what gets taught, what gets supported with research funding, and so on. Who are the necessary first movers? Journal editors, program chairs, funding sources, professional associations. The article that I wrote on why are IPE journals becoming boring was inspired by a panel of editors of IPE-related journals that I attended at one year's ISA meeting. And the journal editor said, you know, it's not our problem. We have no control over what the submissions are. And so if we don't get submissions of a certain kind, there isn't much we can do about it. And my argument was precisely the opposite, that journal editors could take the initiative. They could invite more work that overcomes the pathologies that I've been talking about. But they don't seem to feel they have an incentive to do so. And part of the problem, of course, is that there are page limits with journals. They can only publish so many pages in a year's time. And so it's a zero-sum game. Any more work of type of counsel, that's counsel in nature, means giving up something else in terms of comprehension and critique. Program chairs, the same thing, funding sources, so on. So it's easy to see the problems. It's easy to see what ought to be done. It's not so easy to come up with a solution to the practicalities of implementation. That's the point that I am at in my in preparation of my manuscript on rethinking IPE. I'm working on this problem even as we speak, and I certainly would welcome any suggestions anybody may have. In the meantime, I want to thank you all for your attention, and for the invitation to be with you today, and I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor. Yeah, this was really a thoughtful talk, clearly defined in terms of issues, the evidence with clear examples, with plenty to work on. That is the task that you leave us, I feel, and to explore and debate. I think that is the point. Briefly, it was inspiring, which we really thank you, Professor, for your time. To enhance the short time of the event, we have selected 5 scholars, 3 recognized professors in IPE at the regional level, and 2 advanced PhD students of global political economy in FLACSO, Ecuador. These are Professor Diana Tutsi, thanks Diana, from FLACSO, Argentina, Professor Javier Badel from PUC Minas Gerais in Brazil, Professor Germán Prieto from Javeriana University in Colombia. Thanks, professors, for joining us and for your work. And 2 PhD candidates, Juan Pablo Salazar and Santiago Carranco from our Department of International Studies here in FLACSO, Ecuador. Before I pass the word to Diana, the term to Diana, I would like to open the debate with one question related to the IPE mainstream, Benjamin, an understanding of peripheral development finance in regions such as South America, given the fact that you have plenty of experience in the international money and the political economy of finance and currency. As you know, in the North, development finance has commonly been taught, even at the academia today, as an issue only grasped by ideas of development and dependency theory in the region. But produced during 6 decades ago during the Cold War. Even more, there are a good deal of postgraduate programs which still teach that Raúl Prebisch, for example, is a sort of father of critical approaches and even of dependency theory. However, regional contributions in the last decades highlight that this is a sort of anachronic and misleading approach that do not match so much the reality of neoliberal globalization, especially after the 90s. To what extent do you think that the IPE at the North and the South might dialogue and find bridges to explore more comprehensive approaches about such an important issues in the global political economy?
It's a really good question, or if I may say, set of questions. Ernesto was good enough to provide me with some indication of what the questions might be, and so I've done a little preparation. And I just want to, on this comment on Raúl Prebisch, I think that there's a fair, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there's been some reconsideration of his importance, and feeling seems to be that he was better at, it wasn't so much that he was the father or the inventor of the structuralist view, but that he was a good proselytizer. He spoke well for it. And I have a quote in my advanced introduction to international political economy, free advertising. I have a quote from an American scholar who says, "It would overstate the case to term Prebisch the father of structuralism, though he was certainly present at the birth and has since played the role of godfather and high priest." I thought that was a good quote. But you know, it's clear that there is a problem of communication between the mainstream schools of IPE in the North and work on IPE that is being done in the global South, in Latin America, other developing areas, and we can include China here as well. There's not enough communication. There are explanations to explain, at least in part, including language issues. It's very difficult for somebody who is trained, somebody living in Germany and knows English perhaps as a second language, but may not be able to read anything in Spanish or Portuguese from Latin America, let alone Japanese or Chinese. If people in the global South want to reach an audience in the global north, they have to write in English. And given the historical standards that are applied by journals or publishers in the north, much of that work gets diluted and loses its distinctiveness in trying to meet the standards of peer review in the global north. So when you ask to what extent do I think that IPE in the north might dialogue with the south, it seems to me that there's a lot of room for improved dialogue. Excuse me. I don't know why this is. I'm having this tickle. But I'll give you one example where I think that more communication would be possible. Think about dependency theory. Think about dependency theory. Dependency theory, and I know that there are still people in Latin America who write in this vein, with good reason. Dependency theory emphasizes the core periphery distinction and emphasizes the hierarchy within the trading system. Exactly the opposite of the global north, where approaches to trade theory still tend to be based on the economist notion of comparative advantage. Excuse me, going back to David Ricardo's original exposition in the early part of the 19th century. They're worlds apart. Those views are worlds apart. The northern view that trade is mutually beneficial, and the southern view that trade is inherently unequal. Exchange is unequal. That seems to me that there's a lot of room here for dialogue. But the problem of mutual animus comes in. People in the north simply say dependency theory. I just had this experience not too long ago where I was corresponding with a senior scholar, and was a good friend of mine at the University in Washington, D.C. And somehow the subject of dependency theory came up, and he said, you know, that was discredited years ago. He said, nobody pays attention to that anymore, by which he meant nobody in the global north, nobody physically. And that's a serious issue, that if neither side is prepared to even listen to what the other side has to say, to look for the right on the other side. Remember that Talmudic story. Look for what might be right on the other side. I think there's an opportunity for common ground to begin to bring those two together. In of all places, East Asia. I think that the vision that exists, the mutual animus that exists between trade theorists in the global north and trade theorists, say, in Latin America, with their emphasis on unequal exchange and dependency, that common ground could be sought by examining and dissecting and thinking about the idea of the developmental state, which comes out of Asia. Comes out of first Japan, Japan's experience after World War II, followed by the Four Tigers, and some of the other East Asian countries, and ultimately by China itself. The notion of the developmental state, seems to me, has elements of both the northern view based on comparative advantage and the southern view based on the notion of unequal exchange. That's the kind of initiative that I think is needed to prevent the field from just fragmenting apart.
Thanks very much, Professor. I appreciate your time and your answer. Now, Diana, you want to follow, please? The mic, yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Jerry. That was very inspiring. And you asked for suggestions. I actually don't have suggestions, just a couple of questions. One has to do with your idea of lack of communication or a dialogue of the deaf. And I wonder if that is I'm sure you're right. I mean, I'm not going to dispute that. But is it a problem of difference in ontologies? I mean, your example of center periphery not having flown in the north is perhaps an example. And the other question has more to do is more related to our work in Latin America or in the South, in Latin America in particular. I don't know if this applies, can be extended or extrapolated to other parts of the global South. And that is your call to take up policy and to move away from theories that are unintelligible. And well, of course, again, you're right. I'm not going to dispute that. So the question is, there is a tradition of scholar, activist, practitioner in Latin America. There has been, and is very strong. I mean, we mentioned Raúl Prebisch, there's Franz Fanon, there's Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who is a father of dependency theory, but became president. It said there's a tradition of not very strong dividing lines between being an activist and a scholar and a practitioner. And there is a sort of even revolving doors. I mean, many of us have come in and out of policy and then go back to academia, etc. So the question has to do with what I see might be a risk happening at the moment. And that is that we may be, in our teaching, and this is the question, in our teaching, I see this happening. I mean, people are starting with theories. What is your theory? Do you know your theories? Have you gotten all your theories right? Do you know the difference between constructivism and realism, and etc.? Well, do you think we have to go that way? I think this is happening, actually. I'm worried. I mean, in my time, and you said, I mean, I did my PhD 30 years ago. I mean, we started with what is your problem rather than what is your theory. If you begin with your problem, I mean, you would be, in a way, not abandoning this tradition of scholar, activist, practitioner that I mentioned, and at the same time be able to take this package of the way we do IPE in the South, which is very related to policy, of course. So those were my two questions. One is ontology, and what is the way, I mean, the risk of becoming too academic in a way.
Well, you put it in your very wording. You indicate the problem. If it becomes too much an exercise of theory, then it's unlikely to have any meaning for a policymaker. A policymaker is really not interested in knowing whether your particular theory is more in the style of OEP or the framework that's been codified by David Lake, open economy politics. The policymaker isn't going to be interested to know whether you start with a paradigm of OEP or a paradigm of critical theory or a paradigm of world systems theory. We're going to want to know, what is your insight? What do you,
the issue?
I think to go right to the heart of it. I'll speak to begin. I'll talk about I know best how the system works in the United States. Obviously, I know that system best. And when we have students reach the stage of preparing to write a dissertation, we invite them to propose subjects. And what do we do? They start with a problem. This is the style that you said that you were accustomed to 30 years ago. that's the way we start, by saying what problem are you interested in. But the difficulty that emerges is that if we know anything about the American academic job market, you're going to have to deal with that problem, no matter what the nature of the problem. You're going to have to deal with it in the using OEP, using the standard methodology that has come to be associated with the American style, the American school. There's no way that a student of mine would take on a subject and say, I'm going to deal with it through world systems theory. I would not encourage the student to do that. Why? Because when he goes out on the job market, there will be virtually no job opportunities for him, because it won't be accepted as mainstream. The point I'm trying to make is simple, that the process starts with a problem, but then what happens is that it can be addressed only using one particular theoretical style, whether it fits well or not. And my guess is that that's the way it works in other areas of the world as well. That there is for mentors who are teaching upcoming students, there is going to be a bias to see all problems through one lens, all problems through the lens of just one theoretical approach. And the result is that the system becomes more and more siloed. You know, that image of silos, where each of us is in a separate silo and we don't communicate. My sense is that if the field is going to survive these pathologies, that it's going to have to force new standards and push very hard for new standards that would require students to examine a variety of possible theoretical alternatives in dealing whatever policy issue or problem that they're interested in. Now, I didn't get your first question. I'm sorry about that.
So, well, the question was: if there's a dialogue of the deaf between, let's say, the Anglo sphere and the South, or is it a problem of ontologies, which builds on the question that Ernesto made? How can we recenter the periphery or the margins? Let's not use center periphery. How can we recenter the margins into the center in order that we share ontologies rather than...
My understanding of ontology is that it has to do with the definition of the key units of analysis. And the North does not have any orthodoxy or any uniformity with respect to ontology in that sense, the sense of the key units of analysis. The OEP people, the key unit of analysis is the state. Other actors come in as constraints or as influences on the behavior of the state, but ultimately it's the state that matters. In other traditions more that we associate with the British school or with work on the European continent, there are other approaches, some at the system level, like world systems theory or Bob Cox's world orders, or Marxist theory thinks in terms of global capitalism. Other ontologies emphasize in everyday IPE emphasizes the very micro level. There are those who emphasize class, those who emphasize social groupings. And there are many different ontologies. So I don't think that that's the barrier. I don't think that's the barrier. It's the barrier is in terms of the assumptions that are made about how which of these are the most important.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor. Professor Javier Badel, you want to continue?
Right. Thank you, Ernesto, for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. You are very kind with Professor Cohen and other friends, Professor Diana, and new friends. Professor Cohen has been an inspiration for our colleagues and students. I've been teaching international political economy for 15 years in undergraduate and graduate, for undergraduate and graduate students. And my question is more related to my research object, that is China. The rise of China, the question is objectively, the rise of China is modifying structurally the global political economy and geopolitics. And we are watching interesting advances in theory of international relations and also in international political economy. How do you observe the evolution of international political economy in China? Its evolution from the Marxist approach, more strong Marxist approach, to more flexible, pluralistic approaches. Nevertheless, its relational ontology is different from our individualistic approaches of the epistemic communities of the North or the mainstream international political economy. Do you consider that today the China international political economy has more critical, more flexible, or more conservative foundations than the other theories you pointed out? It's very complex, but I see this it's about ontology too,
yeah.
Like Diana states.
Thanks very much for the question. I indicated earlier, I made a few allusions to China and IPE in China. It's true that China's IPE, what there is, has gone through an evolution. 20 or 30 years ago, back, well, more like 40 years ago, back when the market reforms were just being introduced under Deng Xiaoping, the universities there were dominated by Marxism, Leninism, and the Mao thought. We all know that. By the end of the century, by the end of the 20th century, certain works from the West were being introduced in China in translation, including Susan Strain, including Cohen and Nye, including Gilpin, including Krasner. That had an effect on the way the field developed. The field has developed in a way, particularly in the last 2 decades, as a result of Chinese students who come to the United States and then go back to China again. Not all of them do, but a good number of them do. The American style has grown more and more dominant. It's taken for granted that they should be using hard science models, should be using a serious quantitative empirical analysis, and so on. So there has been this evolution. What has been the object of it? Has it been comprehension? Has it been critique, or has it been counsel? What's striking to me is the extent to which it has been counsel above all. Counsel. They're not you don't see much in Chinese IPE that looks at, let's say, the role of interest preferences, the preferences of interest groups in the formation of policy, not in the context of an autocratic government. And likewise, not much on domestic policy institutions and the like. What you do see is counsel. You certainly don't see critique. You know, your life could be at risk if you critique the existing system in a way that doesn't correspond to the likes of the Communist Party of China. So what you see is counsel. As I said, the standard format is the problem and response. Is to say, here we have a particular policy problem. Should it be development of technology? Should it be internationalization of the renminbi? Should it be foreign investment of Chinese corporations? Any number of issues posed as a problem, and then a rational solution or a logical solution is proposed using American style analysis, but in a very state-centric, policy-oriented way. Now, it seems to me that one can explain that in a number of ways. But a lot of the explanation clearly has something to do with the fact that there is a long-standing tradition in the Chinese culture that the Mandarin class defines itself in terms of the service to the emperor, to the service to the government that rules with the mandate of heaven. That Chinese cultural background is very important. Add to that the fact that universities in China are all state universities. They don't have private universities. That makes every academic an employee of the state, not a bureaucrat, but nonetheless an employee of the state who is expected to contribute to the success of the state. And so the emphasis is totally different from the emphasis that we have in the global north, or for that matter in Latin America today. The typical scholar of IPE in China thinks of himself as a servant of the state whose work should serve the needs of the state. And there's very little critique because of the fact that this is not a democratic country. When we talk about IPE around the world, we're talking about, until we get to China, I think that I can defend what I'm about to say. Look around the world, IPE has developed in democratic societies. The one exception historically is Latin America, where when the military governments came into power, they suppressed international political economy, along with other fields of study that were in any way critical. And people were either went into exile or went into a different subject area. I don't have to tell you your own history. This is regional history. The one country that has been non-democratic and has been the scene of the emergence of a strong cohort of specialists in international political economy is China. And that's what makes Chinese IPE so interestingly different from the rest of us. The fact that it has developed within the context of a very strictly authoritarian state. State centrism then is not even questioned. The centrality of the state, the Chinese state, to what is understood as the purpose of IPE, it's very clear when it comes to the Chinese. Now, I know that there is also in Latin America, going back to colonial days, a strong tradition of serving the state, and therefore of counsel. But the one time when the democratic context was overthrown, IPE was overthrown as well. It disappeared, as you well know. And so I think that China stands as an exception in all of this. The Chinese have ambitions. You know, they really want to defy the notion of comparative advantage. They want to be better at everything. You know, comparative advantage says you can't be better at everything. You can be better at some things, but not at other things. They want to be better at everything. They want to win the World Cup in soccer by the year 2050. When it comes to IPE, they want to be an exporter of ideas, not an importer of ideas. That's the slogan that they use. That a great power should export ideas, not import ideas. But that comes right up against the authoritarianism of the government, which makes it very difficult to do anything that might upset the government. And so Chinese scholars walk a very fine line in that respect. That probably exhausts everything I know about Chinese IPE, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Even Marxist theories for counsel in China.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that Marxism has dropped out of the curriculum. They don't even study it anymore. They've imported IPE from the West, primarily from the United States, and that's what's taught as IPE now.
Thanks very much. Professor Germán Prieto, your turn.
Thank you, Ernesto, and thank you, Benjamin, for such a provocative talk. I guess we can all easily agree on the need for IPE to be useful for policymaking. But I somehow disagree with the way that you are framing the problem and calling for a solution. And my question to you is, to what extent should we international political economists engage more in counseling or prioritize more counseling over comprehension and critique? And the reason for this question is that what I think that distinguishes international political economy from fields like economics and policy making is something that I've heard Diana many times say in several talks and spaces where I have had the fortune of sharing with her, and is that IPE allows us thinking outside the box. And even more, what I think IPE allows us to do is to break the box of economics and break the box of policymaking. For instance, I think that it is quite hard to provide good counseling if you don't have good comprehension, explanation, and critique, right? So I believe that the more comprehension and critique you have, the better counseling you might provide. And then counseling has a risk, and is that the more applied policy analysis you make, and the more policy counseling you intend to provide, the more technical you need to become. And I think that the more technical you need to become comes at the cost of sacrificing comprehension and critique. So personally, I don't think that IPE is that far from counseling as a main target. I was making the exercise while listening to you, trying to think of IPE scholars that are very much focused on policy analysis and policy counseling. And several names came to me. Yes, Latin American names, you're right on that. But that might be because I read more Latin American scholars than other parts of the world scholars, because I focus in Latin America. My IPE work is on Latin America. But I can quickly think of people like Cynthia Chigliconi, Pia Rigirozzi, who are absolutely committed to policy analysis from IPE perspectives, right? I think that most of the people who work on trade and regionalism, on the IPE of trade and regionalism, at least in Latin America, and I'm thinking mostly of scholars who work on Mercosur, they are very much focused on policy analysis and policy counseling. So I don't think, I don't see that imbalance that you presented in your talk. And then finally, I do think that policy analysis is one subfield of the discipline. I mean, I agree with you that there are many people more focused on comprehension and critique, and that might have to do a lot with the theories they use. But I think that policy analysis is a field in itself, or a subfield in itself in the IPE field. So, and that looks good to me. You know, it looks good that some international political economists are more prone to policy analysis and to policy counseling, and others are more focused on comprehension and critique. I find a good mixture there. So I want to end this comment, just to proceed to listening to your answer to my question, with, I think the big IPE question, or at least it was the big question that my IPE teachers taught me in my IPE masters and somehow after that. And it's Susan Strange's question: quid pro quo, right? Who wins here? And the problem that I see, if you focus more on policy counseling, is that the more counseling you provide, the less you can focus on the quid pro quo question. Because if you're advising on a particular policy, if you're advising on a particular solution, if you start by thinking of what are the disadvantages, what are the bad things about those solutions, quid pro quo implies talking about who wins and who loses, then your counseling won't be that robust. Right? Because when you provide counseling, you need to convince policymakers that that's the solution that they need to implement. But then if you start telling them that, yeah, but this solution will be bad for these people, this will benefit those people, this will have these disadvantages, this will have these bad consequences, then they will say, then why are you advising me on that? Right? So I think counseling is a good thing. I mean, it's a desirable thing. I totally agree with you, but I think it comes with a cost. And it is a cost that I don't see why all international political economists should assume. Thanks a lot.
And thank you. I must have misspoken, because I certainly did not intend to convey the idea that everybody in IPE should now engage in counsel rather than comprehension or critique. That was not my intention at all. A healthy field can have people who do people who specialize in one or another of these. A healthy field can have people who do pure comprehension, pure critique, or who concentrate on counsel. There's no reason why everybody has to make that commitment. So I'm sorry if I gave a different impression on that. Now your point is well taken, that there must be some background understanding of comprehension and critique to make useful policy recommendations. The last thing that I would want to do is to advocate that people just willy-nilly say, well, I think you ought to do X. I think you ought to do this. No, what I have in mind is very reasoned and theory-informed advice, but put in language that would be accessible to a non-specialist. Those are two separate points. the first point is to use theory as a way of justifying the particular recommendation, acknowledging such things as the fact that there will be different distributional consequences. Susan Strange was quite right to always keep in mind the question of qui bono. But I don't think that it means that that one is necessarily biased in one way or another, as Bob Cox used to suggest. He said theory is always for something. One can be reasonably neutral. It's difficult to be completely neutral, but one can be reasonably neutral, and it should be part of the responsibility of counsel to anticipate what the distributional consequences would be. That would be one of the criteria by which to justify one type of policy rather than another. So I want to emphasize that it's not something for everybody. That it's not free floating. It doesn't free float. It's got to be rooted in good comprehension and or critique. The last point I just wanted to respond to is that you said the characteristic of IPE that you're aware of is that we think outside the box. There are 2 points I would make on that. One is that we do tend to be disproportionately influenced by other scholars who are most proximate to us. Here in Latin America, clearly other Latin American scholars are closest for you. And in the United States, the group that I'm most familiar with, tend to be most aware of are the Americans. Somebody in Britain would be most aware of others who are working in Britain, and so on. And so there is the risk that we are biased by the IPE scholars we know, who may not be representative of the whole. And I realize that I could be a victim of that too. I try to acquaint myself with as much as possible of what is going on outside of the Anglosphere. When I wrote the intellectual history book that was published in 2008, my hope was, my anticipated audience was primarily American students and scholars in the United States. And so my hope was that I would expand their horizons by introducing an entirely different style of IPE, namely what I call the British school. And then it turned out that people criticized me for not being expansive enough, for leaving out a lot. And that was why I decided to write the next book, which was Advanced Introduction to IPE, to try to bring in IPE traditions from other parts of the world as well, to expand horizons even more. I have a very hard time convincing colleagues in the United States to read even what is done in Britain, let alone what is done in Latin America or in China. They just don't have an interest in it. It's dismissed. I quoted somebody from a major university. It's very hard to get them to do that, but that biases me in terms of what I think are the problems in the field. And the notion of mutual animus is what I'm most exposed to in the United States and what I read from Europe. I would hope that you would be sensitive to the possibility that your sense of what is done in IPE is somewhat tilted because of your greater familiarity with what's done in Latin America. When you say thinking outside the box, that, of course, to me, sounds like critique. It sounds to me like the tradition that is pursued by those who label themselves critical theorists or radical or heterodox. And the only comment I would make is that in thinking outside the box, it's possible that we all just put ourselves in another box. I remember when I was a teenager, there was a certain style of wearing one's belt when I was a teenager. Instead of the buckle being right in the middle of my belly, teenage boys were putting it on the side. They were being nonconformist, they said, by putting their belt buckle on the side rather than in the front. But by forcing all teenage boys to do the same thing, they were actually just going from one form of conformity to another form of conformity. And that's the risk of people who say, I'm thinking outside the box. I may just be joining another box. There's nothing wrong with thinking outside the box as long as you don't, just become a prisoner of a different point of view. What I am advocating in the book manuscript I'm working on now is a much more flexible openness to be sensitive to other perspectives, theoretical approaches, models, paradigms, whatever you want to call them, to be sensitive to them, to borrow the best of what they can offer and so on, but not to become the prisoner of another. That's the major theme of the book as I'm preparing it. Until you all tell me that I'm on the wrong track and I need to correct it. So,
Ernesto, can you allow me to make a quick comment on last point that Benjamin made?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so very quickly, Benjamin, there's this very popular cartoon in Latin America that maybe you know, which is called Mafalda. And there's this very, very popular joke that Mafalda says, there's one more person who, so he would be, that's one more person of the bunch of people who don't want to belong to the other bunch of people, right? So I totally agree with what you said about the boxes. But then just to complement this point that Diana has made in many occasions, that IPE allows you thinking about the box. At several times, we spoke with Diana and we said, now we are getting into another box, just like you said. But then the good thing of IPE is that this is the box we prefer, because personally, I believe that IPE allows you taking a bigger picture of the relation between politics and economics and how politics affects the economy and how the economy affects politics without getting into the technicalities of economics, which many times kind of obstacle your reflections, limit them. You need to be tied to certain paradigms, as you just said in your talk. So yes, definitely thinking outside the box puts you in another box. But then when it comes to choosing what box you want to belong to, the reason why I prefer IPE is because I can get away from the technicalities and provide maybe a broader critique, right? So my point was maybe getting more focus on policy counseling will get you into a technicality, into these economic technicalities that will kind of hamper or hinder your possibilities to take the broader picture. But yeah, I totally agree with you that puts me in another box.
Thank you, Germán.
I just a quick response. The theme that I developed in my intellectual history book and firmly believe is that part of the reason why the field of IPE is in trouble, in my opinion, is because of the fact that it has tried to imitate economics, what I call creeping economism. And I think that that's a terrible mistake. IPE has a lot to offer, but it does not what it has to offer is not to rival economics in the technology of the techniques and methodologies of economics. The advantage of IPE is in bringing in the way in which there is a reciprocal and dynamic relationship between economic considerations and political institutions and issues. The core of IPE, you're absolutely right, has to do with the integration of economics and politics. And that's where the emphasis should be made, not on reintroducing the methodologies of economists, because IPE is never going to be able to challenge economics in terms of methodology. But where it has a comparative advantage is in bringing in issues of interests and ideas and institutions and so on.
Thank you, Professor. To continue, Juan Pablo.
Thank you, Professor, for your excellent presentation, and thank you, Ernesto, for allowing me to address Professor Cohen directly. Professor, my question has to do with probably the need to introduce new lines of study as part of IPE. Most of the research that I have found since I started my PhD is related to trade or traditional finances. And I think that there are other areas of study or topics, such as underground, informal, or parallel economy, foreign ed as well, to name just a few examples that have received limited attention from scholars. And this is an aspect that some authors, such as Ravenhill, already noticed some years ago. In my particular case, I think that I've found a difficulty, I've had the difficulty of finding studies about foreign ed that go beyond the analysis on how to improve the efficiency of donations or development assistance loans. Only a few authors questioned the development ed system or raised concerns about the possibility of change. Therefore, Professor, I would like to ask you, how do you think the field of IPE could be opened in order to include new areas of study?
Excellent question. The starting point for my answer has to be that there is an enormously long list of topics that could conceivably be addressed under the umbrella of international political economy. As part of the preparation for the book I'm working on now, I wrote to dozens, literally dozens of colleagues representing a variety of intellectual inclinations, representing a variety of locations. And I got back, I sent them a series of questions and asked if they would take the time to respond. And got back close to 60 responses. And one of the questions had to do with what might be added to the agenda for the international political economy. And the list was incredibly long. People mentioned everything that you could possibly imagine. The question then is, where do we draw the line? What do we say should be included in IPE and what doesn't belong? One way to approach this was I went through 4 top IPE journals over a 5-year period, 2014 to 2019. It included IL and Right, and also International Studies Quarterly and New Political Economy. And I looked at what they had done on a random selection of 6 possible topics. 2 of them are what I call type 1 because they're very close to the core of that. Herman and I was talking about the core of economics and politics. That's the rise of China and climate change. And then my type 2 were those that introduced additional considerations from related disciplines. And I chose migration and financialization. And then I looked at 2 so-called, what I call type 3, that are way out from the core of politics and economics. And for that, I chose feminism or gender on the one hand, and coloniality, a new term that was Latin American in origin. It was a Peruvian sociologist who invented the term coloniality. And what I found was very interesting, that for some traditions in IPE, there's no inclination to go beyond the core. That's as much as they want to do. They're willing to look at the rise of China because the rise of China fits very well in the traditional political economy. And the same thing could be said for climate change. It's a collective action problem we can deal with using the usual tools. So, whereas other groups of a more critical persuasion, more likely to engage in critique, are much more inclined to go to type 2 or type 3 issues. There's no reason why we can't do all 3 types, but we have to expect that some types of problems are going to attract more conventional analysis, more mainstream US style analysis, and others are going to be attractive more to people who work in a more critical tradition or radical tradition, heterodox tradition of one kind or another. There's nothing wrong with that, but what we have to get away from is the notion that there is just one list or one agenda for the entire field. That just isn't going to work. Some people are going to say that doesn't belong. Some people are going to say that doesn't belong. What it should be is we should be emphasizing what each of the different variants of the field, what is their comparative advantage? What is their analytical strength? What are they best at? And let them work, concentrate on the issues that they're most attracted to deal with. So my answer to your question is that we should be including new fields of study, new areas of study. Those 6 that I mentioned, could mention many more. We could talk about pandemics. I think you may have heard that there was a pandemic lately. There's water shortages, there's famine, there's inequality, there's populism, nationalism, there's technology. The list could go on and on and on. And in the survey that I conducted, the list did go on. I had probably 30 or 35 different possibilities on the list after looking at all the responses. The point that I'm making is that there are lots of important problems out there. There are a lot of IPE scholars who have something to contribute in the way of counsel. And the two, therefore, should be matched. Those who have the ability and the willingness to offer counsel should be dealing with these problems.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Please, Santiago.
Thank you very much, Ernesto, and thank you, Professor Cohen, for such inspiring talk. However, my question has to do a little bit more with my current research that is concerned about the shadow economies and these covered words that once Cox stated, and specifically about the finances and the industry goals. In this sense, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to ask one of the academic authorities of the field of international political economy of money about these topics. And the concern is that money is the instrument that facilitated the consolidation and propagation of economic systems that the humanity has maintained until this day. As thought in the pre-modern civilizations, these instruments fulfill the characteristic of reserving and expressing the value of productive activities, as well as the means of exchange for goods and services. Today, its properties has changed in the sense that since its centralization and regulation by the state, besides the properties already mentioned, money also acquired the property or the characteristic that it could become a commodity or an article of exchange. This opened a gap in the economic system to generate a new economic activity that is based on speculation. This activity now represents one of the most important parts of the international market, even exceeding the productive capitals. In this regard, I would like to raise the two following questions. First, is the production and the regulation of money the strongest instrument that potencies, in its time the United Kingdom, France, and later the United States, have to consolidate their hegemonic power? Do you think that money in turn acquires not only the property of merchandise, but also the property of an instrument of power to consolidate and maintain an hegemonic or civilizatory project? And the second question is that many authors talk about the emergency of a new multilateral pact. Does the purchasing power loss of dollar against other commodities and against these new cryptocurrencies represents evidence to affirm that financial values and institutions that were established globally in the 84 and were modified in the 71 now are mutating? Thank you, Professor Cohen.
Thank you. It's nice to have a question about something I may actually know something. I've written on and off about money for well, it's over 60 years. No, over 50 years. My first major book was about the pound sterling as an international currency, published in 1971. So it's 51 years ago. Your first question, is the production and regulation of money the strongest instruments that powerful nations, I guess would be the translation, have had to consolidate their hegemonic power? There is no question that money can be an instrument of power. No question about it. Susan Strange said something about money gives power. The rich have always known that, something. In this particular context, money can serve as an instrument of power in two ways. First of all, it can be used in a direct fashion. In effect, it can be used to, if your currency is at all valuable in world markets, if it's at all attractive, appealing, desired, in demand around the world, then you can use that instrument directly by offering it to friends as a signal of support or to help them out, or to reward them for doing things that you want, or alternatively, you can cut off those that you can deprive those that you want to punish in one form or another, or signal disapproval. In other words, money can be used directly as a carrot or a stick, by either making it available to your friends or depriving your enemies. This is in the language of political science. We're talking about side payments and sanctions. We're talking about reward and punishment. We're talking about carrots and sticks. They're all the same thing. And there's no question that that great powers whose currencies have become or are in the process of becoming attractive can be used in this way. Then there's the indirect way in which money serves as an instrument as well. If your currency is widely used and accepted, as for example, the dollar has been frequently in Latin America, in many countries of Latin America during periods of high inflation, then you, the issuer of the currency, can run deficits in your balance of payments. You can spend money outside the country. You can spend it for investments. You can spend it for aid. You can spend it for military. You can do whatever you want, and you can pay with your own currency. You don't have to worry about the deficit, because people will be willing to accept your currency and hold on to it because they like it, because it promises protection against inflation, or a safe haven in volatile times, one way or another. Jacques Rueff, a French economist, called this deficits without tears. And Giscard d'Estaing, Giscard d'Estaing, when he was finance minister under Charles de Gaulle, called it the exorbitant privilege, America's exorbitant privilege, that the U.S. At that time, and still for that matter, that the U.S. can run deficits in its balance of payments and not have to worry because the money will be accepted. We just run, in effect, we run the printing press. Thomas Friedman, the columnist for the New York Times, said this was a really great deal because we get real goods and services and assets in exchange for little green pieces of paper. You know, it's an instrument of power, no question about it. So we have two ways by which money can serve as an instrument of power. The interesting question is what comes first, the chicken or the egg? You know, what comes first? Is it the power of the nation, which then makes the currency attractive and thus usable as an instrument of power? Or is it that money becomes an instrument of power and that in turn then contributes to the power of the state? And my answer to that, which I spelled out in a book called Currency Power that was published a few years ago, my answer is it's both. It's a mutual relationship that the currency contributes to the power of the power of the state contributes to the appeal of the currency. And it's really not possible to say that that is all cause and effect. One cause, one is the effect, but rather that they are mutually reinforcing. Now, you then ask, you know, people have been asking about the dollar for a long time. Is the dollar losing its power? The short answer to that is that the dollar is still a powerful instrument of power for the United States. Just ask the Iranians, whose economy has been so badly damaged by financial sanctions imposed by the United States, depriving them of access to markets, depriving them of the ability to sell their oil because it has to be paid in dollars. There are lots of examples of both direct and indirect use of the dollar as an instrument of power. You ask legitimately, as many people do, whether this is that there's a loss here, that is the power of the dollar being eroded? Is the U.S. Facing a situation in which the system is mutating, as you put it in your question? One thing I always say when asked about, are we in a transition of one kind or another? Are we changing? Are we going through a mutation? Students ask this, and my response is to remind people that there was an economist named Jacob Viner many years ago who defined a transition period as that interval of time between two transition periods. Excuse me. Which is to say, things are always changing. And there is no question in my mind that the dollar is losing a degree of power. No question about it. If we compare, let's say, 10 to 20 years ago, the US dollar accounted for over 70% of global reserves. Now it's down to about 60%. Not dramatic, but slow erosion. Slow erosion. If Donald Trump had his way, it would have been accelerated because so much of this represents a loss of trust in the United States. People once saw the dollar as a guarantee of absolute value, the safest of all safe assets in the world. After 4 years of Donald Trump, it's not so clear that that's the case. It's not so clear that Joe Biden will be able to reverse that. The fact is that there is a mutation going on. It's a slow, incremental mutation, a slow transition that will take years, in part because there is no obvious alternative to the dollar yet. The euro is not an obvious alternative. The Japanese yen is not an obvious alternative, certainly not the Swiss franc or the pound sterling. The renminbi might someday, but it's certainly not now. And so that keeps the process slow. The way I like to think about it is that it's not a question that the wolf is at the door about to devour the dollar. The wolf is not at the door. It's more like termites in the woodwork, slowly eating away at the foundation. That I think is where we find ourselves today. It makes for a very interesting period of study of the role of money in the international economy. I grew up during the era of, when the dollar was clearly dominant, and so it comes natural for me to think in terms of the power that represents. But we're entering a phase now where the dollar is slowly losing that authority, and the questions that are raised by that are very interesting.
All right. Thanks very much,
Thank you.
Professor. I think,
Thank
well,
you so much for the answer, Professor.
it is a bit late and many people is leaving. So in order to be fair, I would like to take at least one question from the rest of the colleagues. I already got one, but I just wonder if anyone here wants to raise the question for Professor Cohen. Anyone wants to ask any particular thing or something? Okay, there is one question, which is from Claudia Donoso. And Claudia Donoso, I am going to read that. Thanks, Claudia. She says, to what extent feminism as a critical theoretical framework can transform our understanding and dominant view of global political economy?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, the first part of that again?
Yes, to what extent feminism as a critical theoretical framework can transform our understanding of global political economy?
There have been feminist scholars who have been arguing for the central importance of gender in the international political economy as it has developed over the last half century. I'm thinking of people like Spike Peterson in the United States. Other names I for the moment don't come to my mind. But there have been a number of Juanita Elias, she's at work, has edited an entire handbook about feminism in IR. There's a body, there are a group of scholars who have been promoting this notion for years. But I included feminism as one of the 6 possible additions to the IPE agenda in the chapter I just recently finished. And when I looked, I saw that in a period of 5 years, 2014 to 2019, in the 4 journals I looked at, while there were over 60 articles that touched on the rise of China, there were only 9 on feminism that touched on feminism. That's a big difference, huge difference. And it says something about the lack of impact that this literature has had until now. I say that sadly, but I think it's true. I think that and I should mention, by the way, that international organization had zero. The American school in particular cares nothing about gender as an issue in IPE. Now, is it important? I think it would be extremely important because so many of the assumptions that we make about the nature of international economics, international politics, the interaction between the two, so many of the underlying assumptions are based on a masculine view of the world, are based, created overwhelmingly by men. There were some women, of course, and Susan Strange, of course, is the first who comes to mind. In the United States, we've had people like Helen Milner and Joanne Gowan, Judy Goldstein, Lisa Martin. But the reality is that the real pioneers of the field, at least with the major exception of Susan, the major pioneers of the field were all men who naturally brought a point of view that was inherent in their upbringing. It's natural for, given the way boys and girls are raised, that there will be some systematic differences, and those systematic differences are embodied in basic assumptions about what we do in IPE. It ignores completely the reproductive society. It ignores completely the role that women play in the home, in raising families and taking care of the home and the like. There's a great deal of room for greater attention to be paid to these, but the reality is that apart from I almost said hardcore, but I think you know what I mean, a determined minority of women who have been promoting the role of gender in IPE, there just isn't any appetite for bringing it into the mainstream of IPE literature. Sad though that may be.
Muy bien. Bueno, thanks very much, Professor Cohen. Thanks very much to the public. I don't know if Esther Pereira de Almeida says, Professor Cohen, thanks you for your explanation and thanks you, FLACSO, for hosting this event. It was amazing and productive and so much ways. Night, everyone. Okay, I think that everyone is tired. When I see Germán, Javier, Diana, who has a couple of hours more, Gladys, que está ahí, she just arrived from the beach. We are jealous. Gladys, anyway. Santiago, thanks. Everyone, thanks. And in particular, you, Professor Cohen. The doors are open.
I see one box here labeled Maria Antonietta. Can we just, Maria Antonietta, are you out there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Just want to say hello.
Yeah, so glad to see you. Yeah, I'm very much enjoying. I'll write to you.
Okay, please do, please do.
Yes.
And I just want to thank everyone involved in today's session. Diana, it's good to see you again. Haven't seen you since Buenos Aires a couple, 3-4 years ago. Germán, nice to meet you. Javier, nice to meet you as well. I want to thank everyone for the questions and thank Ernesto for the invitation.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Ernesto. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ernesto.
See you
Good night.
Good night.
Diana.
Good night. So long.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
I leave now. Thank
Bye,
you.
Germán, Javier. Thanks very much. Santiago, Juan Pablo, thanks so much.